Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's live broadcast via SAVCA's live LinkedIn and YouTube channels. We are cognizant that a lot of you will be looking to join the inaugural virtual Sustainable Infrastructure Development Symposium to Regulation 28 for the benefit and for the private equity industry. We'll look to conclude within the hour. As usual, we welcome your feedback, your comments, so please feel free to show us what you think or feel about any of the comments made by our panel. And in addition, please feel free to add your comments to any of the chat boxes or live feeds that you'll be watching through. Without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Tanya van Lill, who will introduce you to our panel.
Good morning, everyone, and it's wonderful to be here. This is a first for SAVCA where we have a virtual live link event. We've hosted various webinars, but that was more from an educational perspective. These events going forward are going to be to discuss topical issues like today's SAVCA position paper on Reg 28 and proposals we would like to see to the position paper. We've got a very exciting panel for you today who's going to share their insights and thoughts. We've got Rory Ord from 27/4 Investment Managers, Langa Madonko from Summit Africa, Stuart Theobald from Intellidex, as well as Shelley Lotz from SAVCA, our Head of Regulatory Affairs, who's going to discuss some of the frustrations our members experience with Regulation 28. So thank you for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to Rory to talk to us a little bit more about the private equity industry.
Thanks very much, Tanya, and thanks to everyone for joining us this morning. So this is an important issue for the broader pension fund industry as well as the private equity sector. The pension fund industry in South Africa runs into trillions of rands, and Regulation 28 is the piece of legislation that sets out the limits on how that capital can be invested. So for everyone within the savings and investment industry, Regulation 28 is a big deal. This piece of legislation was revised about 10 years ago now, and it actually took a very long time to get that revision to happen, because as you can imagine, there was a lot of interest in how it was revised and what the final version might look like. That last revision was the first one that actually brought in private equity as a separate category or a separate asset class within Regulation 28. Previously, any pension funds wanting to invest in the private markets outside of the other asset classes listed within Regulation 28 had to do so under the 2.5% other category that was left for anything else that people might want to do. In the current Regulation 28, there isn't a limit that's allowed for private equity, and it's grouped with hedge funds at the moment for a wider category, and we'll hear a little bit more about that in the next slot. I think what SAVCA is asking for here is a recognition of the growth of private equity. This is an asset class that has grown enormously globally. Over the last 20 years, we've seen it go from a very small asset class to something that is now a major part of retirement funds across the world. And if you look at what's called the Big Seven, the largest retirement fund industries across the world, then actually quite a large percentage, more than 20% of assets actually goes to unlisteds within those Big Seven, which make up 90% of the world's retirement savings. So that means private markets is a very significant asset class globally, and one that I think we need to pay a bit more attention to here in South Africa, and also from a policy perspective. So in South Africa, the industry has been growing nicely over time and now has assets under management of around 170 billion. Part of that comes from South African retirement funds and part from other sources. There's been some good support from global sources in the past, and in more recent times, the South African retirement fund industry has started to pick up more of the capacity within the market. But this 171 billion rand that's invested within the private equity space in South Africa it only results in around 1% of pension fund assets actually coming into private equity. Now, this doesn't mean that it's a uniform thing, that every pension fund in South Africa has a 1% allocation to private equity. Quite the opposite. What we see is that in some of the largest retirement funds, we see quite large allocations, and in some instances they bump up against their Regulation 28 limits. And in other smaller pension funds, we actually see that perhaps because of the low allocation that can be made to private equity, not much attention is paid to the asset class at all, and most small pension funds actually have no allocation to private markets whatsoever. So we think that it's time to rethink this. So you might ask at this stage, well, why should pension funds actually be looking at this space? Why include private markets in their thinking? And there's some good reasons for that. Firstly, it's clearly a diversifier. If you look at the rest of the assets that pension funds can invest in the listed markets, whether it's equity, bonds, or cash, there's a lot of correlation between them, especially in times of difficulty in the markets, and they're very much more of a standard choice for pension funds. If pension funds are looking for something else with different sources of return and different underlying assets to invest in, and investing in a wider universe of assets, then they have to start including private markets in their thinking. Secondly, as a source of alpha, what we've seen globally is that private equity and private markets more generally have been able to actually produce returns in excess of listed markets. This makes sense if you're taking away some liquidity constraints on the assets. You're able to capture an additional source of alpha. And the third thing, particularly in a South African context for pension funds, is around the consideration of impact and investing in the real South African economy. Now, we know that the JSE, for example, has a very large offshore exposure component to it. And we've found that in recent times, pension funds in South Africa have been wanting to find channels where they can invest in the local market and have impact in the local market. And private equity is just one of those channels. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Shelley, who's going to take us through some more of the details around the regulation and the proposal that we're putting forward.
Thank you so much, Rory, and to Tanya. So I'm going to start off by just talking a little bit about Regulation 28, why it's there, and what the historic criticisms have been with regards to Regulation 28. So really, it's issued under the Pension Funds Act, and the main purpose is to protect pension funds from poorly diversified investment portfolios or portfolios where they're considered too risky or aggressive. So how do they achieve that? Well, really what they do is they set out in Regulation 28 what the acceptable asset classes are or asset categories and limit the percentage of funds allocated to each of these. So the current criteria, as Rory mentioned, was essentially effective on 1 July 2011. What the FSB, or the Financial Services Board, now the FSCA, also published was additional guidance at the time, which was criteria for private equity fund managers that they needed to fulfill under Board Notice 1 of 2012, which was specific guidance that allowed pension funds to invest in private equity funds. The things that those sorts of items were considered was the suitability of private equity investment, portfolio valuation methodology, which included things like stipulating that you needed to implement the international private equity and venture capital guidance in terms of valuing the underlying portfolio, the transparency and auditing requirements for the private equity fund, and that a private equity fund manager needed to be licensed in order for the pension fund to invest therein. This notice has been effective since 2012 and is really embedded into the private equity industry at this stage. So a private equity fund can only invest when it's specified in the regulation and within these limits. What essentially happens, though, is if there's market fluctuations or corporate actions where those go out of sync, you've got a certain amount of time to report to the regulator that actually you've breached your Regulation 28 limits and get them back into place. Well, really what happens, though, is actually over time, it's not portfolio diversification that we're actually questioning in terms of what our strategy is. It's rather how this diversification is governed by the legislation and compared to the fund's own strategic asset allocation and risk processes. So worldwide, countries place a cap on the specific asset classes and the exposures of pension fund. And we are not dissimilar to that. In the 2018, there was a study done by the OECD, which found out of 77 countries that were surveyed, 8 provided no ceiling at all. Several countries distinguished between listed and unlisted, but they had a really high cap on what those both asset classes could invest in. Where investments in unlisted equities tend to be capped, the ranges are quite high. So it can be up to 30%, which is in Spain, and as low as 5% in Colombia. And only Denmark, Germany, Norway, and South Africa actually have private equity and hedge funds under a single limit. So really what happens is these different practices just show that there's no one size fits all in terms of how diversification should happen and what is the right way to diversify a portfolio. So this should also be considered, we think, in terms of the context of South Africa's specific challenges, like high levels of unemployment and inequality. So pension funds and their members are increasingly considering not necessarily just how much they can have when they retire, but also what they retire into. So think about access to healthcare or access to shopping centers and how difficult it is to be able to do that in rural communities. Namibia has taken a slightly different approach in terms of their version of Regulation 28, which is called Regulation 29. And they've created a minimum amount of 1.75% that pension funds must invest into their domestic unlisted investments. This was done to stimulate their domestic economic growth. So what's been the largest criticism of Regulation 28 historically is that really pension funds with strategic know-how and the ability to manage various asset classes, including investing offshore, may not be able to optimize their portfolio, and they still need to meet the overall Regulation 28 criteria. And this may not represent the best mix of assets or asset classes in maximizing the returns and the risk and minimizing the risk. In the case of Regulation 28, specifically as it relates to private equity, well, private equity, hedge funds, and then an other category are all included together with a single limit. So what we would do is to question, well, why are private equity and hedge funds included in the same category? Firstly, private equity and hedge funds are not necessarily correlated, and the fundamental drivers of risk and return are very different for these asset classes, and consolidating them under the 15% limit through Regulation 28 makes it difficult for pension funds to manage while still trying to optimize their risk-return profiles. Thirdly, the developmental or sustainability impact of both of the asset classes is also hugely different, because really the one is a more sort of passive management style versus an active management style for the private equity category, which makes it difficult for the pension fund in implementing effective ESG strategies. And off the back of that, I'm going to pass over to Stuart, and he's going to talk about SAVCA's position paper and what we think in terms of our proposals. Thanks, Stuart.
Sorry.
Sorry, apologies. Thanks very much, Shelley. The SAVCA position paper is available on the SAVCA website, and I'd urge you to go and have a look to read through that. It covers some of the points that you've heard from Rory and Shelley already regarding the importance of diversification for pension managers and the developmental impact that private equity can have in the South African economy, which is particularly important as we face the economic recovery post the current crisis. So you've heard a bit about the current position of Regulation 28, and I'm just going to outline it for you on this slide. So at the moment, Regulation 28 specifies various asset classes that pension funds are allowed to invest in. And these can, dominated by the two main asset classes of listed equity and debt. But alongside those, there is an other category that represents 15% of assets under management of pension funds. Now, this categorization of debt, equity, and other sort of reflects early thinking in portfolio theory that the two main asset classes, and then you have another that can cover or capture all others. Now, Regulation 28 has developed somewhat, and that property has been moved out of other into its own category. But the status quo as it stands is that private equity finds itself within that other grouping, alongside alongside hedge funds, as well as any other asset class that happens to arise. So quite often at the moment, for instance, in light of today's Sustainable Infrastructure Symposium, infrastructure assets are also included there. Now, as Shelley has said, this doesn't make much sense from a portfolio management point of view, because the drivers from a risk-return perspective of hedge funds and private equity, for instance, are really distinct. And pension fund managers in practice aren't going to see them as a single asset class. So our first proposal is that private equity should be separated into a distinct asset class with its own allocation ceiling. Now, the 15% category for other has a further set of limits. 10% within that can be allocated to private equity. So our proposal is that 10% becomes its own allocation and its own ceiling specifically for private equity. The second recommendation is that ceiling be increased over time from 10 to 15% of assets under management. The 15% level, as Shelley touched on, is quite far below many other countries where we see similar levels of development. And to really gain the diversification benefits that private markets can bring to an overall portfolio, one would like to see more flexibility given to fund managers to increase exposures. But it should be done over time. There needs to be a simultaneous increase of capacity, both among fund managers to provide assets to pension funds, and also within pension funds to rebalance portfolios and to increase their ability to analyze and make investment decisions over private equity funds. So a gradual increasing of that ceiling over several years is what we think would be appropriate. So that in a nutshell is the proposal. As I said, the full paper is on the website, and we encourage you to read that. Let me, with that, hand over to Langa Madonko, who can discuss what the proposal might mean for the private equity industry in future.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. South Africa in of itself has a nuanced economic landscape that comes with several distinctions from the rest of the world. And I think one of the things that has been highlighted, particularly as we've taken into account the impact and the effects of COVID-19, amongst other challenges in the recent past, has been how unequal the economy is and how there's a huge need for us to continue to deliver the requisite social infrastructure that will allow better living for the majority of South Africans living here. And I think what the paper proposes by the separation of hedge funds and private equity is that, first and foremost, one of the challenges that private equity has had from a capital raising perspective has been that it's one of the asset classes that needs to be demystified, and there's been a great focus on education on the asset class and how it works. And I think a separation and a distinction between private equity and hedge funds in of itself will be one of the first starts in terms of helping to clarify what private equity is. Because as my fellow speakers have said before, the two asset classes are distinct in their nature and where they achieve their impact and how they deliver their return profiles. And so a segregation of the two in of itself will start to help in the decision-making of trustees as they see the distinction between the two asset classes and how they're rated according to Regulation 28. I think secondly, what it will allow is for private equity, is for pension funds to start to increase their allocation to private equity. This in particular relates to the larger private equity funds, with larger pension funds who have reached the upper end of their cap with regards to Regulation 28 limits, in that in many instances when they are doing their portfolio construction, you have to blend the private equity and hedge fund in that particular cluster so as to come out with the appropriate tactical allocation that you're asset allocation that you're looking for. And the distinction would allow them to have more scope and to look at the two distinct asset classes separately as they go through the process. And then I think also what it will do is that it will allow private equity to continue to play its role in delivering real and sustainable economic impact when we move from threshold of 10% to 15%. It's been highlighted and is going to be highlighted later today in the infrastructure conference that the presidency is hosting, how South Africa needs to do more to stimulate economic growth, to create jobs. And one of the distinctions that where private equity sets itself apart from the other asset classes in Regulation 28 is that private equity is one of those that is able to deliver real and meaningful social impact at a real economy level. And I think this is one of the key issues that we need to address through this. And then lastly, private equity has also been a key catalyst in the South African economy for driving transformation. A significant amount of the private equity funds are transformative partners and be partners in many of the transactions in which they participate, and are also able to bring social transformation by the nature of the investments that they make, by determining in which communities they invest, which most need that impactful investment. The delivery of healthcare is fast becoming one of the key areas for private equity, but private equity is focusing on the areas that historically may not have been at the center of the investment focus of listed businesses. Private equity is also focusing on food security, on water and sanitation, and these initiatives are making South Africa a better place for all of us to live. And on that note, I'd like to hand over to Rory to conclude for us by telling us where to from here for private equity.
Thanks, Langa. Thanks. I think you make some important points there about the focus of private equity, particularly in recent years, how it's kind of shifted from probably where it was in the 2000s, where it was becoming more of a buyout process, more similar to what occurs in the rest of the world. But what's happened really over the last 10 years is there's been quite a shift towards much more impact-related investments. Like Langa says, a lot of focus on transformation, both within the asset manager space, but also very heavily within private equity portfolio companies. There's been a lot of capital that's gone into infrastructure, and it's something that is really a channel for a strong existing channel to select projects and select companies for capital support and for growth in the economy. I think with back to Reg 28, I mean it's clearly a very important thing for both for participants within the private markets, but also anyone within the asset management industry. So I think any change that's proposed is going to be hotly debated. And everyone's opinion is needed here. If you're a supporter of private markets and you want to see a bit more balance in the way that pension funds invest their capital, I think your opinions are needed, and please voice these in the appropriate forums. I think what's clear is from what Shelley was telling us is that there's no one size that fits all. Every company and every country rather approaches their equivalent of Reg 28 a bit differently. In some places in the world, there are no limits. In other places, quite restrictive limits. I think what we need to be thinking about is what South Africa needs, what's appropriate for our retirement fund members, and what's appropriate for us as South Africans and for the development of the country, and come to some compromise around what's going to make most sense for us as a whole. To reiterate SAVCA's position, we think it's the right time to relook at these limits, to distinguish between private equity and hedge funds, which we don't really see as being appropriate in the same category, and then to look to raise the limits over time to be in a more balanced position. I think we may have some questions that have been coming through from the audience. Mel, are you going to direct these?
We do, Rory. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add all the panelists. Just please mute yourself so we don't get feedback. I'm going to add you back to the stream, and then we can deal with these questions. So, Stuart, I think you saw the comment there from Anne. Thank you so much, Anne, for those commentary. Do you want to grab that for us and respond to Anne's comments? Maybe just take our participants through the actual comment.
Sure. So Anne's making a very interesting point about risk, return, and impact. And we discussed a bit about how private equity often has an impact mandate and really does, I think, more than other asset classes, is integrated impact measurement and impact objectives into its investment strategy. And as pension funds have started to integrate ESG thinking into their mandates and investment decision frameworks, the role of private equity to meet some of those ESG objectives becomes much clearer. And Anne's making the point that if we move the asset management industry to optimizing between risk, return, and impact, you'd get the results that we're looking for, that there would be greater allocation to private equity and that policymakers would be happy with that. I think that there needs to be a synchronicity here, that one has to work with pension funds to improve their ESG thinking and integration of ESG issues into investment decision-making, at the same time as you work with private equity industry to make capacity and a pipeline of investable assets available to meet that pension fund demand. And I think that's a clear part of the reasoning behind this, that Regulation 28 can make a bigger pipeline available to the pension fund industry at the same time as it works on understanding and integrating impact into its investment decision-making framework. So just some thoughts there from Anne. I think really important that the discussion around impact takes into consideration Regulation 28 as it stands and the constraints that it places on allocations by pension funds in order to deliver ESG and impact mandates.
Thank you for that, Stuart. There's also a comment there by Ngoko Sakile, and it's a very self-centered, given that he is working in the infrastructure asset class, but just talking about the missed opportunity potentially for the infrastructure space.
Sure, I'll jump in on this. Let everybody else jump in as well. But I think this is also a very exciting question. You know, infrastructure is very important. We have the Sustainable Infrastructure Symposium on the go today. It's going to be a very important part of the economic recovery process. And if you just look backwards as to where infrastructure investment has come from historically, and we look, for instance, at the Renewable Energy IPP program, the equity elements of the investment in that program that are essential to unlocking much greater volumes of investment, because equity has to come first before you can leverage into debt and so on, that the private equity industry really stepped up to the plate in providing that risk capital that underpinned over 200 billion rand worth of investment into the IPP program. So that illustrates part of how the private equity industry plays a role in driving infrastructure investment. Now, the point that Ngoko Sakile is making here is that infrastructure can be thought of as a unique asset class in its own right. There is a very big debate in the academic literature over whether infrastructure is an asset class or whether it's a subclass of asset classes like listed equity, private equity, debt, and so on. I think in some mature markets, infrastructure has developed risk characteristics that allow it to be seen as a single kind of asset. So its volatility and return dynamics are the same whether you're investing into it through private equity or listed equity or debt. But at the moment, I think in a South African context, actually your volatility and return characteristics are better defined by the asset class definitions we commonly use than treating infrastructure itself as an asset class definition. But I think there are interesting discussions to be had about how Regulation 28 could be amended to facilitate greater investment into infrastructure. I think at the moment, though, increasing private equity's ceilings is one part of the answer to creating greater investment capital, risk capital for infrastructure investment.
Anybody else want to get in on that question?
Perhaps I can just add a couple of comments on that. I think I would echo what Stuart said with the debate around whether infrastructure is a separate asset class or whether, whether it's the components of it that are similar. And I think from the way that we discuss these kind of things with our clients and the way that we discuss them in our own organizations, I think probably fits a bit more with making the distinction between listed versus unlisted. I think there's kind of greater similarities in making that divide when you look at, for example, the way that the regulatory environment works, and you look at the way that the structuring of the types of fund works, and the way that investors come into listed investments versus unlisted investments. I think that's kind of the bigger divide. So that's generally how we talk about things. What I would say is that, what's this greater conversation around Reg 28 also includes considerations around things like unlisted debt, unlisted real estate. There's broader categories of unlisted assets that are also part of these considerations and part of this conversation. Earlier on we heard Langa mentioning things like investments in healthcare, and there's also a hot debate around whether investing in things like hospitals and schools are investing become academic. We have to kind of look at the way that their risk return characteristics work and how they're kind of formulated into investment options for pension funds, and then decide how they should be categorized on a basis that makes the most sense in the grey circumstances.
Thank you for that contribution, Rory. There's two more comments in the chat box. The one from Fernando around what the impact of the African common market is in allowing international investments in South Africa and potentially other countries in the region, if any of you are willing to comment on it. Sounds like this is a topic for a different day, but Fernando, we've taken it on board and we'll get back to you on that one. The other interesting one there from Peter, thank you Peter for submitting it. Is there anything that CDC could assist the pension funds with, especially on development impact and ESG and private equity? I know the CDC group isn't represented here this morning, but the point well made by Peter that most South African pension funds are interested in private equity subject to meeting their ESG targets.
I can take that one, Mel.
Thanks, Shelley.
I think historically, the international DFI community has been a very strong supporter of private equity. And with that has actually led to the ESG and sustainability reporting, etc., being very embedded into the private equity industry. And I think what we're looking to do now is almost as you change from a DFI community that invests in private equity to the pension fund industry and insurers and the larger institutional investors, there's almost that knowledge gap that may have existed. And sometimes it's easier to come from an asset allocator or an asset owner to help educate other asset owners, because obviously they come from it from the same perspective. So things like where the other pension funds, the larger ones, are helping to work out how they can then use their skills to show how the smaller pension funds can invest and what characteristics to look for, lessons learned, things like that. Or really the international DFI community that have long been investing in private equity and they know all the pitfalls, is to help the pension fund industry to be able to capacitate themselves with what that knowledge and skills are and things to look out for to be able to increase their allocation to this asset class in a very sustainable and well-managed way.
Thank you, Shelley.
Add to that as well, just to say that, I think organizations like CDC play a very important ongoing role. They're trusted bodies, within the investment space globally, both in South Africa and around the rest of the continent. And the way that they invest and the way that they do things is watched by institutional investors, and they can, the way that they do things definitely can encourage others to walk that path with them. So I think I would encourage CDC to continue being open to conversations with institutional investors, continue sharing information, and continue being as transparent as possible with the direction of their criteria and the way that they think about things. All of that sort of thing really helps the local investment community to invest alongside them and to invest into things that can have these kind of impact outcomes in a way that manages risk and keeps everyone investment safe.
Thank you for that, Rory. I see there's a lot of comments agreeing with Anne's statement there. Mark agreeing with Anne telling Mark to hurry up. I can see we're all on track here to do the right thing. I'm not seeing any other comments, so perhaps I can hand it back to you, Tanya, to close the session off for us.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for our panel for sharing your insights today. The private equity industry has a lot of opportunity to make a real significant difference to the South African economy, and we're hoping that our position paper is a position in the right step, so that the right voices can be in the room and make sure that post-COVID, private equity continues to make a significant impact on our country, and that we continue to ask the right questions and push the boundaries in terms of what will make this country great and how do we get out of this crisis stronger than before. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Tanya. With that, we'll end the broadcast. Just a reminder that President Cyril Ramaphosa will, at 10 o'clock this morning, virtually open the inaugural Sustainable Infrastructure Development Symposium of South Africa. And should you wish to follow that, please visit their website, www.sidsa, that's sidssa.org.za. Thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you to our panelists. To the next one.